I've got a book. I don't sell books, but my books will be made available here or in Nampa at the museum there. So anyway, Goodale was my first prospect. I took over Goodale's life. No one had ever written much about him. I finished his life. When I was writing, I almost had finished my book. Nobody knew what happened to Goodale. And I was about to close it, send it to my editor, and I did a quick search, and Oregon opened some new records online, and I found them, and we found Tim Goodale. And we closed the book with the time of his death and the closing. Oh, okay. All right, I'll move that around a little bit. Need to also. All right, I'll get close to this. All right.
There you go.
So anyway, we finished Tim Goodale. But after the book came out, my wife and I went to Oregon, did research, found the trail where Tim Goodale was murdered in 1869, and located his grave and so on. And I put that in a paper that's been out a long time, but it's been in my files. I'm turning all this stuff over to Erickson, to your group here. He has a thumb drive with all these files on it. I also have a paper on Emeline Tremble that I did a year ago. I actually traced her mostly into Oregon after she had gotten there and her time over there for 3 or 4 years, living with some families there, which really prepared her life for a long life and a lot of difficulties ahead. This paper is also available. I have the file on the thumb drive, and they could make you copies of this. We have some brochures from the Oregon Trail Association. You can order your Goodale books from them. I did bring a copy of Don Shannon's Utter Disaster. If you haven't read it, read this, and then this will really open it up for Emeline Tremble. And in Nampa, they have these books, and I think you're supposedly stock them here too. And so you can, this is on the can't even think of the Walmart site on 12th Avenue in Nampa, where the stage station was in Nampa. Again, began from Madge Wiley's note to me one time. There was a stage station there. And then the director of the Canyon County Historical Society said, "Jim, do you know anything about the stage station?" I said, "No, I'll find out." It's a wonderful story of this man who opened the stage stations, all the things that happened. And he eventually lost his mind, died in the state hospital at Blackfoot. But many things in between. The longest running case in the Idaho Supreme Court was about the land where Walmart is now. I won't tell you all about it, it's in here. 11 years trying to figure out what happened when the land was sold. Turned over to his wife, she died, took it back, sold it, and there was a minor who didn't get his part. When he turned 18, they had to redo everything. Anyway, 11 years in the Supreme Court of Idaho. Anyway, this stuff that's available to you, and especially Emeline Tremble's life, when she came through in 1860, ended up in Oregon, and eventually in Tillamook County, Oregon. Tim Goodale came through in 1862 and eventually ended up in Tillamook, Oregon. In fact, Tim and another man started the village of Tillamook, Netarts, Oregon, and it was an oyster fishing village. And that was Tim Goodale's last job, and he was murdered there. And I'll tell you a little more about that. But anyway, I will tell you more about when we arrive at Emeline's time in Netarts, Oregon. So now we're going to go, just look this over real quick. This is a few of the phrases from the book. Left by the Indians. That was put together, someone helping Emeline Tremble in 1894. This has been published over and over and over many times. And it's a really nice book, but of course she didn't tell all the details of everything that happened. You need to read Don Shannon's book on the utter disaster as well. Okay, here I am tonight. I'm so glad to be back with you. I've dropped in once in a while over the last few years. I spent almost half my time, well until this year, almost half my time in India. I began a ministry in India in 2012, and I keep going back, and I'm going next month again. I'm so glad to be able to go over there to people who really appreciate everything I can offer them. That's all I'm going to say about my ministry. I have a little handout over there with my email and so on if you want to pick one up. If you want to write your email on my little tablet there, I don't know why, but write your email there. Maybe I'll write something to you. Okay, so listen, I actually sent a note to Eric and said, well, I have a lot to offer. I'm not sure how long it will be, but my bedtime is 11 o'clock, so I gotta get out of here. But I noticed you guys brought enough food for a midnight snack, so you can stay as long as you want. And according to Eric's, we got till January anyway, don't we? Okay, so Eric's is going to run this little thing for me. This is a quote from Emeline. Sad, sad time on starvation camp, especially in Oregon on the Owyhee River. I'm sorry, my memory isn't as wonderful as it used to be. It takes a little time once in a while to think of these things, and besides, I haven't reviewed all of this for a long time. But we have found some wonderful things about Emeline Tremble, who was the 13-year-old girl who survived the utter family on the utter disaster and made her way to Oregon. We're going to follow her through her life. No one else ever quite traced her beyond Rosalia, Washington, after she had married her first husband. And so we found much more about her, and yet she was a wonderful, calm little girl all of her life. She didn't stir up trouble, but she evidently had some little things about her that her first husband called her naughty at times. And we'll end up with her first husband too in a little while. But she was very quiet. We can't find much records of anything through her life, though we know where she was all the time. Newspapers, city, county records, and so on, not very much available. But we do have a team in Sanford, Florida, Seminole County, Florida, where she died at age 85. And they are looking for a grave. We know the cemetery, we know almost where it is, but the records were lost in the early part of the cemetery, so we're not sure we'll ever place it. But they want to put a memorial down there to Emeline Tremble. I hope you will think about doing that. You hear more about her, and we hope we'll discover more. I think you'll find a wonderful character that she was, and so far beyond her years and everything she had to do, and did it well. Okay, we're going to go to the first slide. Click right on over there, brother. I think they probably have read that. Can you enlarge that a little as we go? This is Linn County, Oregon, and you see Halsey, Oregon there along the highway. This was an area that within just a few miles of Emeline Tremble's life for 3 or 4 years. As she remained there, we'll tell you more about it as we go. The red spots, let me see if I can find my clicker here and I'll point them out. There we go. These red spots are important to her. And let's start right here. This would be in the first home that she might have lived in there with a family called Allingham. And then they moved to another home. And eventually they moved down here. There was a homestead here, but it never was completed. And they moved down here and homesteaded this area. I'll tell you more about it later. Then this was the Tremble family, which was a cousin of Emeline, and she says in her book she lived with them part of the time and the Allinghams part of the time. The Allinghams had 2 little children, and the Trembles had a great big family of older children, so she probably stayed there and helped take care of the little kids. But she seemed to love the people that treated her well. This is a very important place, and we're going to talk more about it as we go along. So, anyway, within just a few miles of Halsey, Oregon, let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Enlarge it, please. While I was doing my research, I found for some reason this jog in the road in the middle of a field. I had a clue about what it might have been, but it took a lot of research to find out and prove what it was. Lynn County, Halsey area, Muddy Creek was over on this side. So this is a larger enlargement of the same thing. Strange little crook in the road. It has been sitting there since the 1950s. Nobody ever straightened the road, changed it. So brother, move on, please. Here is the square. That something was in this square, and we found the evidence here of an old trail through the fields. Now that trail is very old. Even the Oregon trail ruts that were put out here 150, 160 years ago, if you'll go out of Baker, Oregon, up over the hill, an aerial view shows you that though those fields have been plowed for dozens, tens of years, many years, the soil was changed enough by the traffic going through that you could look down before the crops grow. You can see a difference in the color of the soil, and after the crops grow, then you also see the difference in the color of the plants in the field. They are still there. So I was trained when I was working with the Oregon Trail Association to look for these kinds of things, and I began to notice this coming through the field. So let's move on to the next one. Here we are. This is the remnants of an old trail or road that came from an area over here, and it came to a school that's set here. The road was put around the school. We'll kind of show you the progression of what happened there, but the road was put around the school. That schoolhouse was built with stone by a very wealthy man, Mr. Allingham. We'll tell you more about him. And it stood there until the 1950s and was used until the 1950s. I only found on 1957 map it had disappeared. Go ahead. This is a black and white. Again, you see the traces of the trail coming through the fields and down to this area right in here. That's Smith Road going through there. This is an 1878 picture, a map of part of Lynn County. This is Brownsville, Oregon, became important to her. Here's Halsey again, and this is the area of the school right in here. This is Muddy Creek coming through here, and the Allingham filing of his homestead was said to be on Muddy Creek. Go ahead. Okay, here again is the place of the schoolhouse. This is the 1860 railroad that went through there. And across these fields, coming across here, there was actually two routes of the trail that came, and we'll show you why there were two coming to that area. Now then, we have on the 1853 map, William Allingham's name. It was one of the few that was put on there. He was one of the very first Lynn County men to come in and homestead there. 1853, Willamette River and Muddy Creek flowing right up through here. And the X marks the area of the schoolhouse. Right. This is the Allingham homestead, the first homestead. It tells you right here the details about it. It was 2 miles square. This is where the first house of the Allinghams was. And then they moved it up to here, the second one that was built later. Here is the schoolhouse on that corner. And you see that he took in 4 sections of land there. Here again is Halsey in this area. This area was his second homestead, and we'll tell you more about that after a bit. This is a blow-up of the areas of where the Allingham homes were. It was right on this point to begin with when they went to Lynn County, the first log cabin or whatever they built, and then a home was built here a few years later. This area here we think now is the Tremble home. We hadn't found exactly where the Trembles were when they first went there, the cousin of Emeline that she stayed with. So all these trails coming across here from the 2 homes to the schoolhouse. Again, it was on his land. He built the schoolhouse. It lasted a long time. This is the blow up of the second place that they settled, the second home. And the house would have been right in here. We think probably Before Emeline came, they had moved from this home to the second. She probably lived with them up here, and the Tremble family here. Here's on one of the maps, it shows Allingham. This is actually a different place. He was actually, his homestead was in 13S, and then we found out he had taken some areas that he built businesses. He had several businesses over the time he was there. Go ahead. Here's Brownsville and Halsey in perspective, and the homestead, the school, and the home where they were. This is the location of the first road that went from Brownsville to their home. There weren't any other places here until within a couple of years after his homestead. So again, the placement of all these areas, and most of Emeline's life was spent right in this area. From the time she was 14 in February of 1861. Allingham Homestead, again, the same, a part of the blow-up of the same map. Harmony School, this is where the road would have been put through. Would have continued here later, and here, again, this is the road that was put in after the trails across here were not used anymore. And the Tremble home right in here. Again, this is a blow-up, shows Muddy Creek. This would have been the first road coming into the first homestead, or the first home on the homestead, and the second one, and this is where the present road still comes in, and that home is being used by people. This, I found the map where it had this, this is where it put, if there was a home without buildings and so on, this is what designation they would put on the map, quite an old map. And this is a satellite photo of the same. This was a stream that flowed this way on, through this way and on out. It maybe have seeping a little water now. You see the trees and so on there. Anyway, it's a water spring, and so they would have had their home right close here. It is the only home on the Allingham homestead, and we know the Trembles and Allingham were very close people, so that's why we still think it was the Tremble place. Go ahead. Now, here it shows on the map, school district. It was called number 40. I think it eventually combined with Halsey and was number 67 or 57. Anyway, these names on here are important. Here again is Allingham, the possible Tremble home, and the roads that were put in, and the road around here on through. Go ahead. The name Porter is important. He is still here. Now, we have to understand, this is 1855. What happened to the homestead? Allingham surrendered the homestead without finishing it. I'm not sure it was able to get some money for part of the land that he had or whatever, but within 2 years, then these were being laid out on that part of the homestead. He stayed on the place that he lived here. The trail could no longer go through here, so it had to go around. And again, the Tremble place here and the school down here. But in 2 years after he had filed his homestead, all of these others were on the same pieces of land. Go ahead. Here's the old schoolhouse again, a little blow up of this corner where the schoolhouse was shown. This is one of the earliest maps, and this is how it was depicted. Harmony School, that was the name of it. Harmony School, there was a little community there of homes eventually that was called Harmony, though it never formed into a village or otherwise, but Harmony School was that first building, and that's what it was called. And eventually we'll find a Baptist preacher came along, started a Baptist church, and they met also in Harmony School. So for Emeline Tremble, when she wrote in her book about being in school, and we'll read a little bit in a little bit, she was in this school for about 3 years, and she talked about how well they treated her, what a wonderful thing it was to be in the school, and then her church meeting in the same school building. Here's 3 maps that shows progression. 2012, it shows Harmony School here. 1912, 1930, and it just has the name of it. 1940 shows that picture. And then move on. This was found somewhere. It was just a poster or something that just showed the Harmony Historic School started in 1855 on that corner. 1957, there's no trace of the school any longer. Here's Muddy Creek going through here. We remember that the school is in section 28, and the homes were over in this area. Right there, one of the homes is still there and another down here. Both Allinghams. Now this was a little note I found about a man named Potter, or Porter, and it says that he was a school teacher and that he lived, it says east of Peoria. We think now it was more southeast rather than east, probably should have said southeast. He had other occupations, but he was one of the early teachers in the district there, and we thought maybe he was one of the teachers there, or the first teacher, and maybe he was a little later because the Porters came in there later and had part of that homestead. Go ahead. Here's Peoria. This is what it says, that he was east of Peoria. But we think his homestead was more down in this area. So here again is the school area. So I'm trying to sort out who was the school teacher there. We go on from here. We think Porter was there, probably the second teacher. Again, the school district, and one of the Porters have this part of the land just across the road, Smiths and others, and that was on that 1855 map as well. Don Shannon, important, so important. He wrote the most marvelous book on the utter disaster research for 20 years. It's extremely accurate. Don Shannon came down though and stood at distances and took some pictures of the area. I was glad that I had been an educator at Melba and knew the ranchers, and I came over and was able to take him down, and we got closer pictures. I found an aerial photo around the early 1940s, late 30s or 40s of Weiss Flat and the area of the ranch down there where the first massacre took part. And you could still see on that the land had not been broken. Across there was all of these trails, and you can see the main trail across there, 2 loops of the main trail that went across. So Don wrote his book. Move it, please. Here's the disaster signs that we put up along the highway, and this is at Weiss Road at Castle Creek. Next picture. There you see the sign, and Weiss Road goes in right over here. It goes back about 3 miles and meets the river. Go ahead. At the end of the road going in is the site of the massacre. We have some signs right in here as well along the road. We were allowed to put them there as part of the Nettleton Ranch. They had come in here on like the 8th day of September, and that's exactly 162 years ago this September. They came in on the 8th. On the 9th, they went across, and an attack began here. You're going to read about all this in Don's book. The attack began here, but it kind of settled down, and some things happened. And they started on across. The Indians rode down the river road. There was another road went down to the river and came up about here and met this road. And they came across here. The old trail ruts used to show right through here real well. This had been broken, but if you stood up on top of Castle Butte and looked down, you could see the trail going across this area, though the land had been broken. Again, the coloring of the soil and the light color shows where the trail route went. Anyway, they crossed the creek, was attacked here, went on down here, and eventually was attacked here. And this is where the terrible attack began. And they drove out into this area, which is a field, and eventually had to abandon their wagons there. Okay, move on. This is a little close-up where they come across Weiss Road, and down this gully that's still there, and out into the flat. And the Indians waited on both sides of the gully here and attacked from both sides, and they were pretty much defenseless. All they could do was drive their wagons on out here and try to surround, get their wagons rounded up. And Don Shannon tells you all the old Western pictures show you the Indians riding around, attacking the wagons. They weren't all that dumb. That was a concept that somebody got. The Indians always rode around and shot them and just rode around like targets and let the folks shoot them. That didn't happen that much. But it did happen here some. And the attack went on, and even though they weren't supposed to attack at night, they did there too. I won't tell you anymore. That's Don's story. Move along. This is a reverse of that same area. Again, the lower trail that came around here and met them, the Indians were waiting here. They came across here. The memorial signs is right here by Wees Road. Again, this is the gully that they drove down. We have a marker that we put in there a few years ago. I don't know if it's been replaced or still there. But you can see how they would have waited on both sides, and the wagons drove down through this gully out into the lower flat. This is a Google flat map picture of the area where they went down and out into the area here. There was a spring on the river, and of course, eventually that pretty much saved their life after they were able to escape. Go ahead. Here's a picture of the same coming out the bottom of the canyon. The wagons were abandoned here, the water spring here. Tim Nettleton told me he remembered when he was a kid there was still some water flowing there, but there isn't now. It's long gone. After they had abandoned the wagons, got water, they went on down the river bank here and around the corner and lost sight of the area as they went around the corner. Go ahead. This is the satellite picture of the spring area, and Tim told me about water flowing there. Go ahead. Now, this is a reverse picture looking back toward the area where they abandoned the wagons. This is a high point on the river, so as they went around the river bank and on down, they would have lost sight. They looked back 1 mile, back to this area, and the wagons have been attacked, and it's dusky, it's beginning to get dark, and they see the wagons burning. Go ahead. And they look back and see the wagons burning. And the families dead. And for some time after that, travelers through the area found human bones and buried them and reburied over time. And so if you go to these people who died on some of the websites that tell about where they're buried, it just says Owyhee County. Nobody knows. This is a map from the area of Castle Butte and the utter disaster. They followed the river. They did not follow the trail for a long ways until they came out, of course, over here by Murphy. They came out and hit the trail again in this area. Followed down. It's 73 miles. They were starving, had nothing to eat, took not much with them. Killed a dog or two and ate along the way, ate roseberries and other things, and just had so little to eat. And they came all the way then to the Owyhee River in Oregon, and that's where they camped and could go no further. The Van Orman family tried to go on down the trail. They went another 45 or 50 miles to just before you get down to Huntington, between Faro Bend and Huntington. This is a sign we put up in Oregon near the starvation campsite along the road over there at a kiosk. Now, Eric's has got all of these pictures. You can have access to all of them you want, and he's got the paper and everything on a file. So anytime you want to come in and ask for something that we're telling you about, there's even more in the files. Go ahead. This is starvation camp, satellite photo. Just a little area where they were for something like 45 or 50 days, waiting to be rescued. The Van Orman family went on. The trail came right down through here where the railroad was eventually put through. There was a railroad bridge here. It's gone now. This is the camp area, starvation camp on the river. And the first note that you read about was where they were here, and they were trying to decide should they eat the bodies of those who died. And they did. Go ahead. Next one's kind of another blow up, shows you where Owyhee is across the river. these people who got this land had the land when we were there. First, we were rather welcome in finding this and trying to tell them about it. Something happened. I don't know, they kind of went nuts and they threatened us. And in fact, during the flood of this river, some human bones had washed out of this area. And they had called the sheriff. They came over and got the bones and hauled them away, and nobody's ever seen them since then. But while I was there, I found some finger bones. I thought they were. I took them home and showed my doctor, and he said yes, and we took them back and reburied them. And that's where the leftovers of what they had eaten was buried. And when the soldiers came into camp, part of Mr. Chase's body was on the fire cooking. And they buried it. So they went on down the trail. Now we're kind of jumping there, looking from the railroad bridge right up in this area was the camp on the river. And on down the trail, just before, at Farewell Bend, before you start up over the hill towards Huntington, the sign is there about the utter disaster. This is a satellite photo from an angle looking down on the meteor crater where the Van Ormans and two of Emeline's half-brother or step-brothers were killed as well. Emeline left the area of the massacre, took 5 younger siblings with her down the trail and saw her brother Christy killed by the Indians at the camp, at the starvation camp, and the 2 little girls died and were eaten, and the 2 Van Orman boys who were part of the mixed family of Tremble and Van Orman went on down the road with Van Ormans, and all of them were killed right here. Several years later, this area was discovered by the description, and a man dug up and found the bones and some material from the dress of the lady and all of that. So move on in, brother. We put a sign in there, and again at the bottom, this white cross had been put in there by the man who discovered this area. It's all in Don's book. He tells you all about when this was discovered. Go ahead. Now we're going to go back to Winnebago, Wisconsin. Emeline Tremble was born in 1847. Here she is at age 3 on a 1850 census in Wisconsin. Her father, Hiram Tremble, and mother Abigail, her and Christopher, her next brother, was born. Libby, the third child, was not yet born. She was born after 1850. Go ahead. Now this is the strangest census we found. I want you to see Emeline Tremble's name here. And she wrote in her book, first got to Salem, Oregon, and stayed with this Perry family. But I want you to look at the date on this, 30th of July. And I want you to know this year she didn't arrive there till November. First we thought this had to be some other E. Tremble. It couldn't be her. But this family was the one she stayed with. Her name is on here. We can't think, and there she is at age 13, we can't think but that when they came around, they were taking the census for how many kids would be in school and so on, and they anticipating the Tremble family arriving there much earlier than they did because of all the massacre and everything. So they put her name on the census, though she was still back on the trail. And in fact, if you look in Don's book, you'll see what was going on July 30th, where they were. Don has it all laid out, all the days through that year. So anyway, then we get to Lynn County. We find William Allingham and his wife Sarah, 2 children, 4 and 2. And then we find just up the census on the same page, but above was Alexander Tremble, his wife Polly, and they have 6 children, I think you can count there, maybe 5 or 6. I think they ended up eventually with 7. But anyway, we found them then in Lynn County, and when you take Emeline's information, she tells you where she was and who she stayed with and so on. So we've proven where she was over in that area in Lynn County. Go ahead. Now this is a double plat. This is the next township down. And this shows where the school was, the location of the first Allingham home. Actually, the first was in here, the second one. So by the time they took this, he was moved up here to this one. And, no, excuse me, I'm not looking high enough. That's the first one, first cabin. And then the school, and eventually we said he turned loose of that homestead, did not finish it, but then homesteaded right down in here, one lot across in this and across over in here, and he finished that homestead in 1866. Now, Emeline was with them 1871, 72, 73. So she was either living part of the time in this home and moved here to this home. We don't know how long it took to finish this place or not. Then the Tremble family has a homestead that finally showed up over here, but it wasn't finished till 1872. Go ahead. This is a blow-up of the map. It shows the exact area, his homestead. Some others had taken up this land, so he took this strip in between. Again, one section back over in the other township. And you'll see his name written here on the document, William Arrington, Allingham. This now is a paper products mill, and this is where that would have been, the layout of his homestead. Next one. Now, Alexander Tremble. This is the outlines of his homestead. He could have homesteaded there as early as 1862, 3, or whatever. And so Emeline might have lived here with them in the later part of her stay in Lynn County. We just don't have the dates where we can understand this. But that would have been a long stretch to finish the homestead. However, this is the relationship of the new Allingham and the new Tremble homestead on Muddy Creek as well, down to the south of where they have been. And there's Alex, it shows A.P. Tremble, it's Alex Pierce Tremble. And in Emeline's book, she talks about Pierce, it called him Pierce. So he was well known by his name Pierce. Same one, anyway, move on. This is the area near Halsey of the Tremble family homestead, 1860s and 70s. This would have been the area where the house was. The rest of it would have been land that was being farmed. And this is a blow-up of the house, of the area where she was, and we are told that there was a cabin or something right in this area, the original home. So probably Emeline was here with them. We just don't know the dates. So little information about her. Let's move on. Thank you. This land plat, Trumbull patent, signed by Ulysses S. Grant. Now, this is an unidentified school, but there's a good chance that it could have been Harmony School. It was the only stone building that we could find any evidence of in the area. All the other buildings were frame, board, log, and so on, and didn't last as long. As we told you, this one was built 1855. It was discontinued its use almost 100 years later. It was built by Allingham, who had a lot of money. Now, we think, as much as we could find, this was probably a class a little later. We looked at it and said, oh, wouldn't that have been nice if that was Emeline with these other children there? But we found no evidence of a woman teacher when she was there either. We still think it was either the porter or a man named Clark that we will come to in a few moments. Now, I want you to read this because, again, this is about Emeline and some of her quotes. There's a transition here that made a big difference. And the key words here is school and church. And all we can discover about her it took these two institutions and the people there to condition her to overcome the terrible time of her life on this trail. Don Shannon used to take us, and I would go with him. We would do the trail tours and stop at starvation camp. Don would talk about it and weep like a baby because he was very tender-hearted. Emeline and these people became almost like his family. And when my daughter was 13, Emeline was 13. And I began to study this in 1994. And Emeline Lucinda Tremble became my second Lucinda. I could hardly imagine my little girl Lucinda going through what she did. I am so glad to find out more about her, finish her life as much as we can. But the transition that had to make a difference was this school where she enjoyed herself so well, and she wrote about it. What a wonderful place it was, and the kids were kind to her. But being there, she couldn't help but remember all the things that happened. And then the church came along, and as I told you, we found evidence that Harmony Baptist Church met in the school building until it was also moved to Halsey. Go ahead. This was John Clark's homestead. John Clark was the man who came here, who was a school teacher and a preacher. He lived go back just a second, he lived just north of Harmony School. Harmony School is right down in this area. So he was north, and the description of the homestead and where we found it on the maps are exactly where he would have been. So, okay, now move. Okay. So John Clark, we won't read all of this, but this is two sources. Of course, part of this is mine from the paper that I have here, but it describes John Clark being a school teacher and starting the Baptist church and where he lived. And so we found more about him, and it seemed like his years when he was there was exactly the right years to have been teaching school there when she was there. Again, we think Porter came along a little later. Now, here's John Clark on the 1860 census. Remember, we looked at the 1860 census with the Allinghams and Trembles. Here he is with his wife Elizabeth and 7 children. I don't know how he could have survived on a school teacher's salary, do you? Maybe as a preacher they paid him more? Not in a Baptist church. Okay, I'm a Baptist, I can criticize him. I am Emeline said I was baptized in a closed communion Baptist church. That's very strict, very much scriptural. And I am a closed communion Baptist in India. I'm a member of Chenathala Padu Baptist Church in Andhra Pradesh, India. And I will not move my membership back to America till the Lord's finished with me. Thank you. All right, so here's John, and he's on the census. And again, it's in this area right here. Pine was another little area that was pretty close to Harmony. Now we go to Brownsville. Remember we saw on the map where Brownsville was located. And outside of Brownsville, this was a Pleasant View Baptist Church, the first church in Lynn County, Oregon. And there is still a cemetery there. The building's gone. Eventually the church was moved into town. It became more liberal. It's still there today. It still carries the history of the oldest church. And Halsey is on this highway over here. Go ahead. Here is the Pleasant View Baptist Church Cemetery. One more. Here it is in a satellite photo. Now, it's important because I just finished another paper with 2 volumes of Baptists in Oregon, and I have shown where Emeline Tremble's church came out of the First Baptist Church in Washington County, Oregon. And recently, a man sent me a history trace of my own Missionary Baptist Church in Meridian, Idaho, in 1961 and 2 when I was baptized there. And my church came out of the same church that another line came out to Emeline's time. The only difference is we were baptized 99 years apart. So this is Pleasant View Cemetery. So it's an important part of her life. We think probably they had attended Pleasant View Church because it was already there before Harmony Church was open. And the Allinghams, some of their names is associated with Pleasant View Church, and I think there's one or two of them buried in the cemetery here. Okay, we're going to go on after she leaves. Now what happens is she turns 16 and they find her a husband. We don't know exactly how she got hooked up with John Whitman, but anyway, she's 16, she marries him, and they take off and go to a couple of different areas in Oregon and finally end up in Tillamook County, Oregon. This is the 1870 census in Tillamook County, and it's on the coast at Netarts, Oregon. Tim Goodale was murdered in 1869 in Netarts, Oregon. They had come to Netarts 2 years earlier. They were neighbors of the Goodales, and they were good friends of the Goodales. And you see these names, Murphy, Franklin Murphy. Franklin was adopted by the Whitmans. His name was Murphy originally. Here are two Indian children, Josephine and John Dishaw. Jenny Goodale and Tim Goodale took in Indian children who had no parents when they were there. And they ran an oyster bed and sold oysters to San Francisco. This little girl is 18 in 1869. She would have been 17. A lecherous old man came into the village and came to Tim and said, I want that Indian girl. And Tim, who was normally rather quiet, told him in maybe a few curse words, get out of here, don't ever come back. And this man, who had several aliases, had abandoned a wife and family. I don't know his other aliases, but one of his aliases was Riggs. Riggs, get it in your mind, Riggs. He went out on the route, and this is documented in my paper on Goodale. He went out on the route from Netarts to Tillamook and waited in a hollow there, the only one on the trail that we've discovered. Waited in a hollow when he knew Tim Goodale was coming on his way to get supplies in Tillamook. And with buckshot, he almost cut Tim Goodale in half. That was Tim's end that we found and documented and finally finished our book. Josephine Dishaw was the little girl he was protecting. They were good neighbors. Emeline and her husband took in these two Indian children, and this other boy whose mother had also inherited a bunch of kids when his father ran off. They took in Murphy, and they adopted him eventually and gave him the name Whitman. These two kids grew up and moved on. We don't know what happened to them after this. Go ahead and move along. Here is Emeline Tremble at 16, just married to John Whitman. Am I saying that name right? You know, I get name. Find it and see if I'm Whitting or Whitman or something. Anyway, so this is their marriage photo. We know that within a year or two after they left Lynn County, or after she married him, they were in Tillamook. And they stayed there like 4 or 5 years, and then moved on, I think, in 1871. And they went to Rosalia, Washington, where they stayed there many years. So let's move along. This is Willie. Willie was a newborn baby in 1871, the year after the census we just saw. His mother was named Rigg. His father was the guy who killed Tim Goodale. And Emeline took this baby in at age 1 month or so. raised Willie until he was 8 years old and he died. This is another sadness that was added to her. She could not have children because of her starvation and illnesses from this terrible journey she had taken. So they would take children in. Willie was taken in and died. Move along. Rosalia Washington, J.M. Whitman. It is Whitman, okay. This is his store in Rosalia, Washington. They ran the store sometime. Go ahead. Here they are in Washington. Whitman and Emeline, and there's Franklin. Now he has been adopted. And here is John Rigg, another boy, 14, another son of the man who killed him today. They took him in as well. They would take children in and take care of them. Emeline talked about loving them and how much she missed them when they were gone, and especially little Willie, who died. Now we're going to move on to Wisconsin, where Emeline's family had come from, and she went back to after this husband was gone. Whitman, we'll get back to him a little bit. And we find two families. George Payne, he was a brother of Emeline's mother. She was a Payne when she married Tremble the first time. This is one of his daughters, Mary, 32. She was married to Melvin Fuller. She had 6 or 7 children and died, and she died in about 1882 or 4, somewhere along in there. And so Melvin Fuller is without a wife for just a few years. Go ahead, move along. This is Melvin Fuller and his children. And these are about how big they were when he married Emeline Tremble. After John was gone. We'll go back to John. We got to finish him up. But after John was gone, she married this Melvin Fuller. These folks were so, according to her in her book, they mistreated her so much, the marriage lasted 4 years, and she divorced Fuller. So, we found them on that first census. Let's move along. Here they are on 2 more censuses. Here's one, 1895. This is the state census in Wisconsin. Here they are. One of the kids must be gone because this is him and 6 of his children that are left with him. So one of the boys is evidently gone. And now on the same census we find Mrs. E. Fuller, Emeline, living by herself, age 48. She remained in Wisconsin for several years after she had divorced Fuller. Go ahead. Here's Fuller's grave, Emeline Fuller, and her cousin Mary. Mary was her cousin, the first wife of Fuller. So that when Mary died, he began to look at Emeline, whose husband was gone, and they got married. They married in 1886 and lasted 4 years, divorced about 1890. Okay, 1880. Now we're going to move on to Wisconsin, or back to Wisconsin. Here we are in the 1900 census. You know, there is no 1890 census. It's all burned up or something happened. And anyway, it's gone. There's just remnants here and there. So we have to jump over to 1900. Here is Emeline Fuller, still called Fuller, in Wisconsin, with a boarder living with her. Notice the name changes. She goes from Mrs. E. and Lucinda and Emeline, and that was why it was so hard to follow her on the censuses. So here she is by herself, and still in Wisconsin. It's 1900. Next. Here is 1901, and suddenly she's marrying an old judge, retired judge named Calhoun. He was 74, she was 51. Anyway, move along. Here's a little story we just found. We found something about John, her first husband, we had never known. Her book tells, and she never badmouthed anyone. She just talked about John and how John was killed. We thought she was still married to John. this tells us that John one day picked her up in his vehicle and they drove into whatever the city was, and he came back by himself, and they were divorced. And it says in here that he soon married another lady, and she died within a year. And then he married again, and they were married a little while. And then she died, and a year later he was killed by a train. There's the full story, Mary. We didn't know all of that, but that story is in here. This was published, this is on the 30th day of January 1901, and it was actually published in Wisconsin in a newspaper. So the story is really comical about how Calhoun says, everybody says, well, you didn't know her very long. Well, he wrote her a letter to Wisconsin and said, come on out, I'll marry you. She arrived on the train, they talked for 2 hours and got married. And then somebody said, wasn't that kind of fast? He said, no, we've known the Whitmans for 25 years. I just finally thought she'd make a good wife. So he brought her out on the train, they married and stayed in Washington a while. And then they moved, now go ahead, this is the judge Calhoun. But while they were there, they tell about, she tells in her book about filing on some land in Washington. But they actually crossed into Idaho and filed on some land in Idaho. And we find this, they completed the patent, and it was almost immediately, the land was almost immediately sold, and they moved to Tennessee, where Calhoun originally had come from. Go ahead. This is Calhoun's grave. We think, I couldn't find, I saw the picture, I couldn't find where it was for sure. We think he was buried back in Rosalia, though he died in Tennessee. So, they married in 1901. He lived until 1909 and died, so he wasn't found on either census with her. We find this, Andrew Calhoun, and that she's filing for a widow's year support or widow's pension in the state of Tennessee. And Calhoun, the list of property sold. Now we find her by herself, 5th of May, 1910, living in Tennessee, Coffee Counter, Tennessee, and here she is, Calhoun, Mrs. E. All by herself, nobody was with her. So, she divorced Fuller in about 1990, somewhere, 1890, and then did not marry Calhoun for 11 years, and then he lived 9 years. Here she is, of course, 1 year after he dies, she's by herself, still in Tennessee. 1920, still in Tennessee, by herself. Here she's called Lucinda Calhoun. So she was living by herself all of those years after he died. Now, the big mystery is, how did she end up in Florida? We've been trying to find whoever took her to Florida. Who did she follow? We had some leads, some openings, some hopes, but we wasn't sure. So let's move along. We found her in Kansas in 1920, November 18, 1920. Now you remember she was on the census in 1920, still in Tennessee. But later that year, this is November, the census was done in January. Later that year, she's found in Kansas. Again, just little records here and there we're trying to fit all together, but not much about her. So now, what happens? Within 2 years of this date, she moves on to Florida. Let's follow her. Here we are, Seminole County, Florida. Emeline Tremble, 1930. So, 1920, she's still in Tennessee. Late in 1920, she's in Kansas, and by this time she is in Florida. 10 years later, she lived 5 more years. Let's go ahead. This is Seminole County, Florida. This is Sanford, and a little part of Sanford was Lakeview, and she was in a retirement home there the last few years of her life, and was buried back in Sanford in the cemetery there. Let's go ahead. Here's Sanford, Florida, about 1930. You see the age of the cars and so on. Go ahead. Now, on her birthday, her 85th birthday, in the Stanford Herald, we thought, oh, we found something. Here's a Calhoun who owned a big department store. Well, that's why she went there. Some Calhoun owned a department store. And so we began to look, and here's H.F. Calhoun. And her husband's son was Hiram or something, H.F. Calhoun. We thought, that's why she went there. Oh, no. Suddenly, and there's a paper that I left a copy of here, who has a little history of this guy. Anyway, it's in the paperwork, it's also in there. That tells he came from some other state, his name was different, it wasn't him. So we lost him as a possibility of being maybe a grandson that she followed to Florida. But it wasn't him, different guy altogether. Go ahead. Here is the old folks' home where she was the first inmate or patient or whatever.
Lucky her.
Who knows what they treated her like. She was still a nice lady when she went there. Anyway, the old folks' home was there. I found people who know all about the history of the old folks' home and so on, and I have a lady, Teresa Johnson, who is doing some work for us. Go ahead, move along. And this is the home. It is now a museum. And her roommate on that census was an old lady who was a year or two younger than her, I think. And that lady, we found her obituary, died 2 or 3 years after Emeline. But they were the first ones when this home was built to put in there. And the lady from Seminole County said, you know, the records are really good. It was a very nice place. They treated them well. And she had a pretty good life the last few years of her life. So that's where she was when she died. Now, a terrible thing happens. Here we have the Seminole County, Florida, 1932 record of deaths. And here is a Emeline T. Somebody misread something somewhere and put a T in there instead of an L, but it's really her. We know. We know the death date, and we found the death record and everything. So this is her on the death index. Go ahead. And here is the write-up of her death that was written up by this man was in control of the home there, the director of the county home. Some information about her. She was buried in the cemetery. We got the right cemetery, Lakeview Cemetery, but still no records of where she was buried. You see the T on there? Somebody started putting a T in there, and all the records, including her death certificate, says T, Emeline. Well, what an insult. She was Emeline, wasn't she? Yeah. So, now interesting. Reverend Marler. I began to look up these folks down there, and we found out Reverend Marler, Frank M. Marler, came to Nampa, Idaho 28 years later and pastored First Christian Church for many years until retiring and died in Boise. The same Marler, who preached her funeral in 1932, was up here in the 60s. Okay? Here is the information about him, Stanford, Florida, and so on. And then the Nampa Statesman, 1981, when he died. And it says in here, they were called to Florida. Talking about him and his wife and their ministry. The same Marler. Go ahead. And there again, you see the T in Emeline. And this is her death certificate.
After all she went through, they'd like to get her name right. I said, after all she went through, they ought to.
Well, I guess so. Well, they'll get it right on the records they're finishing down there now. So go ahead, move along. I thought this of interest. Oh, wonderful. In the newspaper, Lucky Strike. If you were there then, you should have been smoking then. Because this says you are protected. Let's pull it up where we can see. You're protected. Oh, in here. You're protected. The concealed impurities are removed by the famous purifying process. Lucky's created that process. 50 million smokers can't be wrong, and I put dead in there. Well, anyway, you should have been smoking them because the cigarettes was much better. Okay, one more. And they said, as if Chesterfield didn't want to compete, they are as pure as the water you drink, as pure as science can make them. Written into the ad when Emeline died. She wasn't a smoker. Okay, one more. This is the cemetery where she's buried. This was just a sign that I took a picture of. It shows the cemetery out front and then a view down into the cemetery. Go ahead. From the front, from the road where the cemetery is at, and it's got a little different name on it here now. It was called Lakeview then, okay? And a satellite photo of the cemetery. Back in the back is an area where the oldest graves were, and they did start in 1931, 32. And there's a little area there of unmarked graves. There are none over here. There are a few up in here. We think she's buried there. One more. A close-up, there's a number of graves in there, but they're not marked, and they have no records to know who was where. But they still might put a memorial back in the cemetery there for her, put it in the area and say she's buried close here or something. We don't know what's going to happen. Go ahead. These are two pictures we found of her when she was a middle-aged lady. And in all of her pictures, this eye was bad. And in her book, she talks about when Christy was chopping wood while they were back in Wisconsin. Christy was chopping wood, and either a piece of wood or the axe hit her or something and punctured her eye. So she only had one eye, one sight in one eye. And it shows up very much in her 16-year-old picture. Go ahead. This is a couple of the publications of her book over time. There's many of them online. You can go search for this book. It's online. You can read it. And May of 1994, the little corner where she spent so much of her life, on the Allingham homestead. Now, I hope you take this little girl under your wing. She was so important. This is her 13th year here. Everything she did, she accomplished more than a whole lot of people do in a lot of years of their life. And then in Oregon, somebody got her in the right places to get the right help. And though she had difficulties, again, here's her first husband divorces her for whatever reason. Only that I think she wrote in her own book that sometimes he would tell her she was a naughty girl. Nothing else. And the writer of that little article said nobody ever knew anything, any problems in their marriage, but they just rode to town one day and he came back by himself divorced. Well, I wondered. Of course, if she'd have been a spiteful person after he marries another one and she dies, he marries another and she dies, and then he dies, she might have said, "You got what you deserve." No, she wouldn't. She never said a bad word about her first husband or any others. Ever. And she talked, all of her words that we found is kind and decent. And the little sign you read there where she said, "I was baptized, and I've found since that time Jesus is a friend that sticks closer than a brother." You know, I've known the Lord Jesus for 72 years. My ministry is in the 62nd year. The last 11 in India has been marvelous, and I'm going to keep going till the Lord Jesus comes, and He is. I don't force anything on me. I just must live my testimony. He is a friend that sticks closer than me. I've been through some of these kinds of hard times. This end of my life is the most joyful I could ever imagine, and the pleasures of being in India. People coming who need help, we give them help and they appreciate it. And they love you with a genuineness of love. And they ask me, come again, come again. We go to villages where the name of Jesus has never been heard. And we preach the gospel. And they come weeping because they live such hopeless lives. Hinduism is a hopeless religion. And they do all of these things without knowing what's going to happen. And it's just a terrible way of living. Jesus gives them hope. We have that to offer. I'm glad I get to do that. Thank you for letting me just share a little bit. While I'm home, I just have this little corner, the secular corner, that I keep pursuing these things. And I'm so glad to finish Emeline as far as we've gone. I really have some hopes of our folks in Sanford, Florida, Seminole County, finding more about her down there, and maybe some other records along the way. I just don't have the time and access to go to these places where we knew she was and look in more newspapers and stuff. But there's evidently some more evidence out there. Anyway, take her under your wing. You know, somewhere, put a memorial here to Emeline Tremble. All the other families, they did a lot of things, and some of them survived and so on. Nobody 13 years has ever gone through any more hardships in their life and been kind and decent to people. They lived 71 more years. Thank you.
All right, if anyone has any questions for Jim, you can come up and give it, talk to him privately, because I'm going to let everyone go. It is past 8, so thanks for coming to the meeting. Harvest Dance next Saturday, and then third Friday in November, we have our Christmas tree lighting. Thanks again for your support. We'll see you next time, and Jim will be here for any questions you got. Thank you, guys.